The Verk High Council chamber smelled like cold metal and old authority. Commander Sira Voss stood in the back row of the human delegation and kept her hands folded at her waist, the way her father had taught her to stand at funerals. Don't fidget, don't give them anything to read. She watched Ambassador Liera Chen at the front of the room, except with a straight spine and a perfectly level expression, the biggest insult the galaxy had probably ever dressed up as a peace treaty. The Verk called it a gift. The planet Kethmura, uninhabited, unclaimed, freely offered to humanity as a gesture of goodwill, of galactic brotherhood, of recognition that humans deserved a world of their own to settle and grow. The Verk High Speaker said all of this in a smooth and practiced voice, and the chamber's translation system converted it into every human language simultaneously, and it sounded perfectly reasonable in all of them. But Sira had learned, over 6 years of working alongside Ambassador Chen, to watch alien faces the way you watch card players, not for what they show, for what they're working to hide. The Verk High Speaker had 4 eyes, and 3 of them were doing the diplomatic work, while the 4th one, the small one, the one the species used for close-range environmental reading, kept cutting sideways to the other council members, little quick movements like shared knowledge passing silently around the room. They were trying not to laugh. Ambassador Chen accepted on behalf of the human race with a nod that could have meant gratitude, or could have meant she was writing a list she planned to collect on later. Sira had served under Chen long enough to know exactly which one it was. Rixor, the Verk overseer assigned to the handover process, stepped forward and read the official planetary terms into the record. Tall creature, blue-gray, 4 elbows, a voice like someone reading a shopping list to a child they'd already decided was too young to understand shopping. Kethmora 17 light years from Earth, first cataloged by Verk survey teams 312 years ago. Uninhabited, atmospherically marginal, no known resources of value. Sira had read the survey data during the 8-week transit from Earth. Every chart, every atmospheric read, every geological layer sample, she had read it carefully, because she was going to be the one living on it, and living requires information the way fire requires air. Kethmora was not atmospherically marginal. Kethmora was dead in a way that made the word dead feel insufficient. The atmosphere was nitrogen and a rotating cast of trace poisons that change with altitude. The soil was hardpan and ancient ash, and whatever biology had once lived in it was gone so completely that even the fossils had turned to dust. The average surface temperature at the warmest zones was -30 Celsius. The equatorial belts ran colder. There was no liquid water, no ice, no evidence of either within any detectable geological layer. The magnetic field was thin enough that unshielded electronics degraded in long exposure. They had handed humanity a graveyard. They had done it with straight faces and formal language, and something behind 4 alien eyes that Sira chose to file under a useful category, wrong about us. She was very patient with things that were wrong about humans. They usually corrected themselves in time. The colony fleet reached Kethmara's orbital insertion point 4 months later. 12 ships, 9,341 people, volunteers, all of them, which meant they were a particular kind of Person, the kind who looked at the survey data and the works barely concealed contempt and said yes anyway. Some of them had said yes because they believed in the future. Some had said yes because there wasn't much left worth staying for elsewhere. Some of them, Sierra privately suspected, had come purely to make someone regret underestimating them. She was in that group. She wasn't going to announce it. She stood at the viewport of the lead ship, the Harrow, and looked down at the planet, the color of an old bruise, brown and gray and a deep purple-black, along the equatorial zones that she hadn't seen in any image. It didn't look hostile. Hostile required energy. Kethmara looked like it had stopped trying a very long time ago and had let everything go quietly. Chief Engineer Marin came to stand beside her, 63 years old, built like a knotted rope, voice like boots on gravel. She had 30 years of colony infrastructure behind her and the attitude of someone who had seen everything fail at least twice and knew which failures mattered. Could be worse, Marin said, looking at the planet. Tell me how, Sierra said. Marin thought about it for a moment, a genuine considering pause. Could be on fire. Valid, Sierra said. The Harrow began its descent. The first time Sierra set her boots on Kethmara's surface, she felt the ground push back. Not shift, not give, push back, a steady, low resistance under the hardpan crust. Like the planet had bones just below the skin, and those bones didn't move for anybody. She noticed it, stored it somewhere in the back of her head, in the folder she kept for things she didn't understand yet, kept walking. The first 3 weeks were survival, which meant they were about prefab domes, atmospheric processors, water, reclamation, and the endless unglamorous labor of making a dead place livable, enough that people could die more slowly inside it. The domes went up on the flattest zone, a wide plateau called the Ash Plain on the survey maps, which was geologically accurate and also, she thought, the most depressing name ever applied to geography. The processors began chewing the poisoned air into something breathable. If you stayed indoors, the reclamation rigs pulled water from mineral compounds, slow and expensive, producing water that tasted like old coins left in a jar. But it was water which was the thing. Sierra had watched 3 colony attempts fail before she'd gotten her commander's rank. All 3 had died the same death, ran out of water before they ran out of people willing to try. She put her best engineer on the reclamation rigs and her second best on backup systems for the first engineer. And she checked those rigs personally every morning at 600, before the daily briefing, before coffee, before anything. People died anyway. Not the water, the storms, Keth Moore. Surface winds built fast and without much warning. The planet's thin magnetic envelope made pressure fronts unstable, and a storm that looked like light weather on the sensors could hit surface. Rated wind speeds that compromise standard suit seals in under an hour. A 4-person survey team went out on day 13 and got caught 3 km from the perimeter. They found 3 of them when the storm cleared. The 4th they never found. Suit integrity failure, the incident report said, as if the words explained anything at all about how a person just stopped existing. Sierra wrote the casualty notifications, sent them home, went back to work. That was the job. Rex Sara's monitoring station maintained orbit throughout, A small Verk craft, officially described in the treaty. Documentation as a supportive, observational presence. Practically a front row seat to a failure he was confident was on schedule. His reports were encrypted in standard Verk civilian cipher, which Earth's intelligence division had quietly broken. 18 months before the treaty, Sierra received translations through the type beam relay that Marin had installed. In week 2, a narrowband array aimed at a satellite they'd put in the opposite hemispheres orbit before landing, because Marin had looked at the survey data on the transit over and said, low and quiet seems like the kind of place where you'd want a phone line they don't know about. Sierra had agreed. Day 22 report, Rex Sara to Verk High Council. Human settlement Kethmore primary. Population maintained at 9,337. 4 casualties to atmospheric event. Infrastructure development within. Predictive parameters, water production. Marginally above projected failure. Threshold, assessment colony will not survive to year 1 marker, primary. Mortality pressure, resource depletion. Secondary pressure, psychological. Degradation from environmental conditions, recommend no Verk intervention. Observation sufficient to document outcome. She read it twice, set it face down on her desk, picked up the coin water. Coffee. Document outcome. She drank, stared at the wall, thought about 4 names she'd already committed to memory and would carry for the rest of her life. Got up, went back to work. Dr. Juno Hale found the first anomaly in week 4. She was not supposed to be outside the perimeter without a cleared survey request. She had also not requested clearance, filed a route plan, or told anyone where she was going. These facts were consistent with her entire 4 weeks on Kethmora, and Sierra had already developed a specific category for the kind of trouble Juno created, the kind that turned out to matter, which somehow made it harder to address without encouraging it. Juno was 29, geomorphologist with a secondary focus in xenoarchaeology, which until recently had been the most theoretically rich and practically empty field in academic science. She moved through the world like she was always slightly ahead of the question she was chasing, and she treated perimeter protocols the way cats treat closed doors, as interesting puzzles, not actual barriers. She appeared at Sierra's office door at 2100 hours, still carrying her helmet, pulling up a display on her wrist screen before the door had finished opening. The ground is wrong, she said, not as a greeting, as a data point. Sierra looked at the display. She was already spreading wider, topographical readings across the plateau's surface. Taken 3 km past the eastern perimeter. Define wrong. Look at this first. She pulled up a comparison, a similar dead world from the survey archive. The surface erosion patterns were irregular, random distribution, the way geology looks when nothing planned it. Now look at Kethmora. The second image had lines in it, not obvious, blurred by centuries of ash, fall and storm erosion, but consistent, repeated, directional in a way that natural forces alone didn't produce, and in 2 locations, angles that were too exact to be chance, right angles buried under dust in time. But there. Wind, Sierra said. Wind doesn't make right angles. Sierra looked at the right angles. She put them in the folder with the feeling of the ground pushing back. Folder was getting full. Stay inside the perimeter, she said. Juno inhaled for an argument. File a formal survey request in the morning. I'll approve it same day. The inhale stopped with a full drone package and an escort. Juno's expression cycled through several things before settling on reluctant satisfaction. She left. Sierra looked at the right angles for another 10 minutes, then she called. Marin, how deep can your ground penetrating radar read? She asked. 350, maybe 400 m with the right soil conditions, Marin said. She sounded like she'd been awake. She usually was. Get it ready, we're running a formal survey on the eastern plateau. A pause, then found something. Maybe, Sierra said. Probably. I don't know what yet. Best kind, Marin said. The formal survey team went out the next morning. Juno, 2 geologists, Marin with the ground-penetrating rig, and 3 security personnel, because Sierra was not sending people into unknown ground without eyes watching the perimeter. They came back 6 hours later with 700 GB of data and faces that had gone very quiet. The right angles were consistent across a 17 square kilometer zone of the ash plain, not random, not geological. Something beneath the surface was creating pressure points in a pattern, structured, repeating the kind of spatial arrangement that implied something had been designed, and at 2 locations, the ground-penetrating radar had found cavities, not the random voids of geological settling, cavities with walls, flat floors, consistent depths, walls that met other walls at corners, rooms 300 m under the dead surface of a world the galaxy's most advanced civilization had described as empty rooms with walls. Juno's formal report was 280 pages. Sierra read the executive summary 4 times. Then she sat with it for an hour and thought about what it meant, that Verk survey technology, which could read a planet's geological layers from orbit to depths of over a kilometer, had cataloged this world 312 years ago and called it empty and worthless. They had known something was here, and they had given the world to humanity. Anyway, she thought about the 4th way to read that fact. The 4th way sat in her chest like a stone. She called a full council meeting. The council met in the main dome's common area because the prefab priority list had correctly ranked breathable air and drinkable water above conference facilities. 12 department heads around 3 tables pushed together, coffee that tasted like the planet and a display showing the ground-penetrating radar image of something large and structured, and 300 m below the ground they were standing on. Sierra let them read it. The silence had weight. Marin spoke first. She always did in silences that needed breaking. How deep does it go? We can confirm 300 m, Juno said. Radar hits its limit there. The structures may continue below that. We don't know. On a planet the Vert cataloged as containing nothing, said Dr. Ravi Park. Yes. Ravi leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people look when they're reorganizing what they thought they understood about something. That's very specific, kind of interesting. Sierra looked around the table. 12 people, all tired, all carrying 30 days of hard, cold planet behind their eyes, all looking at the display like it had just changed the terms of why they were here. We're going to dig, she said. Nobody argued, not one voice Outside, the wind hit the dome walls in. Long, slow pulses, rhythmic, consistent. The same interval every time, no matter how the storm's intensity shifted. Like something was breathing under the ground. Sierra looked at the radar image and thought about right angles buried under 300 m of a world that had been called worthless by someone who had known 300 years ago that it wasn't. She thought about Rixor up in his comfortable orbit writing his careful reports about a colony that wouldn't last a year. She thought about what it would mean to prove that wrong. The ground pushed back under her boots, steady, patient, like it had been waiting for exactly this. She went to find Marin. They had a drill rig to build. The drill rig went down on day 41. Marin had it running 11 hours after the parts were pulled from cargo storage, which was 9 hours faster than the equipment spec sheet projected, and 8 hours faster than Sierra had privately estimated. She had learned over years of watching Marin work that the spec sheets were written for people who didn't know the machines as well as Marin did. The initial bore was narrow, sensor width, not person width, wide enough for cameras and atmospheric samplers, not for anything breathing. They pushed it down in sections, joint by joint, and watched the feed in Marin's equipment bay as the rock column scrolled up the display in slow, dark increments. Gray stone, black seam, gray again. Crystalline layer at around 90 m that fractured the camera light into brief white spatter and then was gone. More gray. The drill passed 250 m, 270. At 283 m, the tip broke through into open space. Not rock, not rubble pressing in from all sides, air. A cavity below the stone and the camera dropping through the bore hole and swinging on its cable into darkness, and the lamp below it catching the first surface it found. A wall. Smooth, not stone smooth, not water worn, manufactured smooth, the kind of surface that meant someone had decided at some point that this surface should be exactly this way. The lamp swung slightly in the cables, tremor, and caught the floor, flat, same material, same deliberate evenness. Ceiling at the edge of the lamp's reach, flat, and on the near wall, running across it in rows that the camera could see only a portion of before the dark ate the rest. Markings, not random, not the pattern of cracking or erosion or any geological process. Markings arranged in sequences, repeating forms with variations. The visual signature of a system of language, or something that had once served the purpose language serves. Writing 300 m underground on a world the Verk had said contained nothing. Marin, Juno, and Sierra stood in the equipment bay with their shoulders almost touching, all three leaning toward the small screen, and nobody said anything for a long moment. "Sweet mother of everything," Juno said very quietly. Sierra said nothing. She was running the math she'd been avoiding for the past week. The Verk had deep scan survey technology that could read a planet's geological layers from orbit at resolutions finer than this camera. 312 years ago, their survey teams had processed every kilometer of Kethmore. They would have found this room. They would have found every room that came with it. Their equipment would have done in an automated orbit past what her people had just done with a drill and a camera on a cable. They had known what was here. They had known for 300 years, and they had wrapped it in treaty language and handed it over. with the expression of people doing humanity a favor. She looked at the symbols on the smooth wall and thought about what kind of thing you hide inside a gift. We need a wider bore, she said. The wider bore took 12 days. Those 12 days were not easy ones, too. Major storm events forced full perimeter lockdowns. The second one ran for 31 hours and pinned the non-essential half of the colony indoors while the surface turned into a solid wall of fast-moving ash. During the lockdown, 2 atmospheric processors overloaded and switched to backup units. The backup units were rated for 60% of full colony demand. For 48 hours, the air inside the domes was enough, technically, measurably. Just not the kind of enough that let you stop thinking about it. Sierra walked the processor bays every 4 hours during the lockdown. Not because she could fix anything Marin couldn't fix, because the engineers in those bays needed to see someone walking toward the problem instead of away from it. 7 people were treated for stress symptoms, 14 for physical exhaustion. 1 broken arm from a fall in the storm supply staging area. The water rigs, against all reasonable expectation, held without fault. Rexor's encrypted Day 48 report reached her the morning after the lockdown cleared. Colony Kethmora primary atmospheric processor failure event resolved within parameters. Storm damage minimal. Population maintained at 9,331. Water production stable. Subterranean survey activity detected at Ash Plain. Coordinates assessment. Geological curiosity investigation. No concern. Colony collapse timeline adjusted. Year 1 survival probability reduced to 17%. Recommend continued passive observation. Geological curiosity. She read those 2 words and felt something tighten in her jaw that she consciously released. She put the translation face down on her desk. She went to the equipment bay. How are we doing? She asked Marin. 6 days, Marin said, not looking up from the drill housing she was fitting. Give or take. Make it 5. Marin looked up, read Sierra's face. Looked back down. 4 and 1 too, she said. There it is, Sierra said. The wider bore was finished on day 53. Wide enough for a person in a surface suit with a harness descent system. Maybe 15 cm to spare on each side. Juno was already suited when Sierra arrived at the drill platform. I'm going down, Juno said, not a request, a fact stated with the calm certainty of someone who had already had the argument in their head and won it. I know, Sierra said. She picked up the first descent harness from the equipment rack and held it out. I'm going with you. Juno blinked. She'd loaded up for a fight. Someone has to make sure you don't touch anything, Sierra said. She knew, even as she said it, that she had no mechanism for stopping Juno Hale from touching things. She was going anyway. Some situations needed a witness who outranked the evidence. The descent was 315 m straight down, through a shaft that was barely wide enough for shoulders, lit by the helmet lamp and nothing else. The cable above her, the only reason she wouldn't become a very permanent part of the geology. Sierra was not going to tell anyone she was mildly claustrophobic. She had never needed to tell anyone before because she had never previously had a job requirement that involved 300 m narrow shaft descents, and she had therefore never felt it necessary to list it. She breathed through her nose. She looked at the rock wall 8 cm from her face plate, and thought about Rex Soares confident. Reports about 4 people lost to a storm, about water that tasted like old coins, about the specific look on a Vark High speaker's face when he was trying not to laugh. The shaft opened below her. She dropped the last meter. The camera had lied about the size. All rooms did. The image always compressed, always made the space feel smaller and more contained than the real thing. Standing in the room was different from watching the room on a screen. It was 40 m across, at least 8 m to the ceiling. The walls ran away into darkness beyond the reach of 2 helmet lamps, and the columns she could see them now, spaced at intervals that felt architectural, that felt like a choice someone had made about load and light and the movement of bodies through space. The columns ran into that same darkness. The room was only the beginning of that room, and the markings were everywhere. Not just the near wall, every surface, floor, ceiling, columns, all of it, covered in sequences of forms that had the dense, purposeful quality of a language that had once been used daily and was now only surviving in stone. Juno was already moving toward the nearest wall. "Hail," Sierra started. Juno pressed both palms flat against the surface. The markings under her hands lit up. Not explosively, not dramatically. Thin line of pale blue light traced through the nearest sequence of symbols, following the carved channels exactly, as if someone had poured slow light into them. It spread from under Juno's handprints to the left, then turned at a junction, then ran along the base of the wall toward the nearest column, then stopped. Juno's breathing on the comm channel was the only sound. "Step back," Sierra said. "It reacted to me." Juno's voice had a specific quality too. It not excitement, not fear, the tone of a person whose idea has just proven itself, and the idea is so large that it hasn't finished arriving yet. "Step back, Juno." Juno stepped back. The light didn't go out. It stayed tracing the channels it had found steady and pale, and then it pulsed. Once slow, even, the interval of a heartbeat, or something that had once needed a heartbeat, or something that recognized heartbeats as meaningful intervals. They stood in the underground room on a dead world and looked at light that had no business existing. "Something turned on," Juno said. "Yes," Sierra said. "It responded to my touch, my hand. Specifically, not the drill, not the camera, human hands." "Yes." Juno turned. In the helmet lamp her face was all sharp angles and shadow. Why would something buried on a dead alien world respond to human hands? Sierra looked at the light, looked at the symbols it ran through, looked at the columns going back into darkness, and thought about how big a room could be before it became something else, a complex, a network, a system. "I don't know," she said, "but the Verk didn't make this. Whatever this is, it's older than the Verk survey, maybe much older. And they gave it to us anyway. They gave it to us because they couldn't open it," Sierra said. It came out quieter than she expected, like something she'd understood for a while and only now had language for. The light pulsed again, same interval. "Patient." Juno looked at the ceiling, markings up there too, in the lamplight's edge. "Sierra, I don't think this is one room. I know. I think this is the entrance to something. I know. We need to map it." "We will." They ascended. The light behind them stayed on. The formal report went to Earth Command. Through Marin's private relay tight beam, the channel that Rex soars. Monitoring equipment wasn't pointed at. Camera footage, sensor logs the exact temperature of Juno's hand contact. Points on the wall. The chemical composition of the atmosphere in the underground chamber, which turned out to be breathable, not Earth standard but not toxic either, as if it had been maintained by something that expected to have visitors again. Eventually, Earth Command's response came back in 6 hours and 40 minutes. 3 words: we are listening. Enough. Over the next 11 days, the light in the underground chamber changed. It didn't spread to new sections of wall, it deepened, got more present. More intentional, seeming like a signal. Strengthening as the source warmed up. The blue shifted slightly sometimes toward a color that existed at the edge of human visible range, a color Juno spent 2 hours cross-referencing against every spectral catalog she had access to, including the Verk standard chromatic index, before concluding that it had no name in any current language because it was older than any current language. Juno went down every day. She made contact with different sections of wall. Each contact activated new lines, and each new activation slightly raised the temperature in the chamber, not dramatically, not enough to affect suit requirements, but measurably and consistently, as if the system were warming up the way an engine does, as if it had been cold for a very long time and needed to remember what warm felt like. The ash plane surface temperature began rising at day 58. Not dramatically, not the kind of chain that registered in the weather systems, the kind that only showed up if you were checking ground contact temperature at the same coordinates every morning, which Sierra was, because she was the kind of person who checked the same measurements every morning, because the thing that kills you is always the thing you stopped watching. Day 58, plus 0.3 degrees Celsius from baseline. Day 60, plus 0.8. Day 62, plus 2.1. On day 63, a crystalline formation broke through the surface 1 km east of the dome perimeter, transparent, pale blue-green, half a meter tall, grown overnight from ground that had shown nothing the previous morning. Marin brought a sample to the geology lab before breakfast. She set it on the analysis plate without saying anything and waited for the machine to work. The machine worked for 4 minutes, then it displayed no match in database. Cross-referencing Viridian standard mineral catalog, no match. Sierra looked at the sample. It caught the dome's interior light and split it, not randomly, not in the scattered prismatic way of crystal, in a pattern specific, repeating the same kind of structured and purposeful as the symbols. Underground. That's not mineral growth, Juno said. From the doorway, she hadn't been asked. To the lab, she'd apparently known to come anyway. It's not growing the way minerals grow. The internal structure is oriented. It has a directionality. What does that mean? Ravi asked from behind her, because Ravi had also apparently known to come. It means something told it how to grow, Juno said. Something gave it a direction to point in. She paused. Something is underground. Sierra looked at the sample, at the way the light came through it and organized itself into repeating segments on the lab wall. How much more of this is coming? Juno was quiet for a moment. A specific kind of quiet that Sierra recognized as The pause before a number that changes. The conversation. I think, Juno said, that the formations will spread across the ash plain within 30 days, based on the subsurface temperature gradient we're seeing. The system is activating. Laterally, the room wasn't one node. Whole plateau is a network. We're watching it come back online. Outside, the wind moved across the ash plain, and when it hit the crystal formation, the sample on the lab plate resonated a clear single tone, the same pitch every time, regardless of how the wind speed changed. Calibrated, designed to produce exactly that frequency under exactly these conditions. Marin picked up the sample and held it. For a moment, she was not a sentimental woman, but she turned it over in her hands like it was something that deserved to be held carefully. 300 years, she said, they had this planet and they never found what's in it. They found it, Sira said. They couldn't do anything with it. Marin looked at her. And we can. Sira looked at the light pattern on the wall, at the way it organized itself into something that wasn't random. Juno touched a wall and it turned on, she said. Marin turned the crystal over once more. Set it down. Ah, she said. Rixor's report on day 65 was different from every report that had come before it. Not wildly different. The format was the same, the language was almost the same, but the certainty was thinner. Sira could feel the places where he'd made deliberate choices about wording. The way you feel a careful person choosing words when the truth has gotten complicated. Geological anomaly detected on Kethmore. Surface, organic crystalline formations. Origin unclear, appearing at surface. Level in ash plain zone, subterranean. Temperature variance detected across same zone, source unidentified. Human colony has initiated expanded subterranean survey at depth, nature of survey objective unclear from external monitoring, recommend Ver Council review of full planetary classification file. Possible reclassification required. Recommend inquiry into historical survey. Data. Recommend inquiry into historical survey. Data. He was telling his own council to go look at what they'd already looked at, because something was happening that their historical survey data had told them couldn't happen, and he was doing it carefully in language that didn't explicitly say, I think the humans found what we buried here, but had enough gaps in it that someone reading carefully could fill in those gaps themselves. He was scared, not of humans, of what was in the ground. He had been scared of it for 300 years maybe, or however long. The Verk had known about it and decided to leave it sealed. And then they'd handed the key to humanity, not knowing humans were the key. Sierra sat with that for a long time. Then she called Juno. How fast can we map the rest of the underground complex? Faster than anyone expected, Juno said. How much faster? A pause, the sound of someone already pulling up plans. What's the deadline? Sierra looked at Rex Sowers' careful, frightened language. Assume someone's going to want to stop us eventually. Then we have about 30 days before they realize we can't be stopped, Juno said. I'll work faster. The crystal sample on the lab table caught the light and sang its single calibrated note into the quiet room, and the note didn't echo. It traveled through the floor, down to whatever was waiting below. The crystal formation spread across the ash plain in 22 days. Not slowly, not the way geological processes moved cautious over millennia. Patient as erosion. They grew the way a fever rises. Committed directional, something in the body deciding it was time to make itself known. By day 70 of the colony, the eastern plateau was threaded with them. Pale blue-green spires breaking the dead gray surface at irregular intervals, ranging from hand height to nearly 3 m. Tall, all oriented the same direction, all resonating at the same fundamental frequency when the wind moved through them. The ash plain, for the first time in whatever span of time it passed since it had been alive, sounded like something. Juno had mapped 43 distinct underground chambers in the first 2 weeks of expanded survey work. 43 rooms, and each room connected to at least 2 others, and the connections ran deeper than the ground penetrating radar could follow, and the total footprint of the complex she'd confirmed was already larger than the entire surface area of the colony's dome cluster. She stopped filing individual room reports on day 72 and started filing a single daily summary because the volume of data had outgrown the format. The summary on day 73 had a line in it that Sierra read 4 times before she was satisfied she hadn't misread it. Revised total estimated complex area 340 square kilometers minimum depth. Confirmed to 600 meters, likely extends further. Temperature delta from baseline across. Confirmed complex zone plus 11 degrees Celsius and rising. The complex is not warming passively, it is generating heat. Generating heat. Something 300 meters underground on a dead world was producing energy actively, because someone had turned lights on and the lights had told the rest of the building it was time to wake up. Sierra walked out to the eastern perimeter on day 73 morning and stood at the edge where the dome cluster ended and the ash plain began, and she looked at what the plain looked like now. It looked different. Not livable, not yet, not safe. The air was still poison without a suit, the soil still ash and hardpan, the sky still that pressing bruise dark without stars, but the plain had texture now, where it had been featureless before. The crystals caught the dim sunlight. Kethmore's sun was thin and distant, a yellow-white point that gave light without warmth and threw it into angles. The formations didn't look random, they looked like they were placed, like they were pointing at things. She pulled up Juno's underground map on her wrist display and overlaid the surface formation positions. Every crystal cluster sat directly above a major junction in the underground network. Every single one. Markers, she thought, they're markers. The system is flagging its own infrastructure from below. She stood there in the thin, cold light and felt the ground push back under her boots and understood, for the first time, with full clarity, that the planet had never been dead, it had been off. Rixor descended from orbit on day 78. He hadn't announced it. The first notice Sierra got was from the external sensor array, a small Verk shuttle, standard diplomatic configuration, entering the atmosphere on a trajectory toward the colony. She had 12 minutes of warning. She used 4 of them to brief her department heads. Stay calm, say nothing about the underground complex unless directly asked, and let her do the talking. She used the other 8 to stand at the dome's main airlock and think about what Rixor's face was going to tell her when he stepped through. The shuttle landed on the flat ground outside the eastern perimeter. He came through the airlock in a Verk environmental suit lighter than the human surface gear built for a species that could tolerate broader atmospheric ranges, and he was alone, which was unusual for a Verk diplomatic contact. When he took off his helmet inside the dome, Sierra looked at his face. He was keeping it very controlled, four eyes, all four doing careful work, all four pointed exactly where he wanted them, but he was standing differently from how he'd stood in the High Council chamber, smaller somehow, like he'd taken up less space than his frame allowed. She knew what that looked like on a human. It was what careful looked like when careful was covering something else. "Commander Voss," he said, standard greeting tones perfectly calibrated. "I am here on a routine observational visit. The Verkai Council wishes to assess colony progress in person." "Welcome to Chthona," Sierra said. "Can I get you anything? Our water tastes like old metal, but it's technically water." He declined the water. She took him through the dome cluster, the processing bays, the hab sections, the engineering workshops, the medical facility, everything tidy, everything functional, everything that told the story of a colony that was not collapsing on Rixor's schedule. He said very little. He made notation marks on a Verk recording device. He asked routine questions: population count, resource production rates, infrastructure status, and she answered them accurately and completely, because accurate and complete answers to those particular questions didn't tell him what he'd actually come down to find out. He asked about the survey activities on the Eastern Plateau. "Geological mapping," Sierra said. "This planet has an unusual subsurface structure. Our geologists are characterizing it. The crystal formations," he said, flat. "Careful." "Yes, we noticed those developing in the last few weeks. Interesting mineral phenomenon. Dr. Hale has some theories about the underlying cause." His fourth eye, the small one, the environmental reader, moved a tiny motion gun almost before she caught it. "Have your surveys identified the origin of the formations?" he asked. "We're still gathering data," she said. Which was true. She watched his face and he watched hers, and the space between what they both knew and what they were both saying filled the room quietly. He asked to see the eastern perimeter. She took him. They stood at the edge of the dome cluster and looked out at the ash plain. The crystals caught the thin sun. Wind moved through them. The sound rose. Dozens of formations all at the same frequency, blending into something that was just below the range where it vibrated your bones, but just above where you could choose not to hear it. Chord, an extremely old chord. Rixor was still. Not the stillness of someone looking at something new, the stillness of someone looking at something they had hoped would not look like this. "Your colony seems to be progressing," he said, "ahead of schedule on most metrics." Sierra said. "Silence." The chord from the formations. "Kethmer is an old world," he said. "Most worlds are," Sierra said. "There are historical records, incomplete records, that suggest this planet may have been inhabited at some point in the very distant past." He was choosing each word like he was stepping on ice he didn't trust before. "Verk exploration of this sector. Species that no longer exists. We know very little about them." "What happened to them?" Sierra asked. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "They are not known," he said. Sierra looked at the crystals, thought about all the things you could mean by. They are not known when you were the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. And you'd had 300 years to look into it. We'd be interested in whatever historical records exist, she said. For context for the survey work, I will inquire with the council, he said. He would not inquire with the council. They both knew that. Very kind, Sierra said. He left the next morning, his shuttle, climbed back into the purple-gray sky, and disappeared. Marin appeared at Sierra's elbow within 5 minutes of the shuttle clearing the atmosphere. He knows, Marin said. He's always known, Sierra said. He came down to find out how much we know. And he's going back to tell the council that we know enough to be a problem. Marin thought about this timeline. Verkai Council meets on a 40-day rotation cycle, Sierra said. Rick Sir would need an emergency session for faster response. Emergency sessions require a quorum of 8 members agreeing on an active threat. Are we an active threat? Sierra looked at the direction the shuttle had gone. We're about to be. She called Juno. What's the next major discovery? I found a central chamber, Juno said. Larger than the others, much larger, at 410 m depth. I've been correlating the tunnel network and they all route toward it. Everything else we found is peripheral. That chamber is the core. Can we reach it? I need a wider bore. How much wider? Wide enough for a person to move freely, not a tight descent, a proper shaft. Sierra looked at the crystal formations across the ash plain, at all the places where the ground was pointing at what was underneath it. How long? If I pull Marin's full rig crew, Juno said. 16 days. 12, Sierra said. A pause. 14, Juno said. 13, Sierra said. Done, Juno said. On day 89 the sky changed. Not significantly, not the kind of change that registered visually at first, but the atmospheric sensors at the top of the dome cluster flagged it. In the early morning hours, nitrogen concentration down 0.3%. Oxygen concentration up 0.1%. Carbon dioxide shifting the poison trace. Compounds thinning, not gone, not safe, but moving in the direction of something that was less wrong. The planet's atmosphere was changing. Slowly, the way a sleeping thing starts breathing differently when it's about to wake, but the direction was unmistakable. On the sensor readout, and Sierra sat with the numbers for a long time, and what she felt was not relief or joy or triumph. She felt the weight of what she was standing in the middle of. Something enormous had been turned off a very long time ago, something that had managed an atmosphere, that had grown things, that had organized a planet's living systems into a working whole. It had been shut down, not naturally, not gradually, but stopped suddenly and completely, and the planet had gone dead in the aftermath. And now it was turning back on, because a geologist who didn't follow perimeter protocols had pressed her hands against a wall. Ravi found her at the sensor station at 400 hours. He was carrying 2 cups of the coin water coffee, which meant he had also seen the atmospheric read and had known exactly where she'd be. He sat down, slid a cup toward her. The air is changing, he said. Yes. How long until it's breathable? I don't know, she said. Could be years. Could be faster, depends on how much of the system is still functional. Depends on how much we wake up, he said. Yes. He drank his coffee, She drank hers. The Vark shut this down, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. They killed whoever lived here, and then they shut the planet systems down, and then they cataloged it as empty and worthless and sat on it for 300 years. He turned the cup in his hands, and then they gave it to us because they thought we'd fail and die, and it wouldn't matter. Yes, but the systems respond to us. Yes, because we're similar enough to whoever they killed. She looked at him. That's where you are right now, isn't it? He said, not a question either. She'd been sitting with it. Since Rixor's visit, the system in the ground had been biolocked, attuned to a specific biological signature, the living signature of whoever had built it. The Vark had known it was there for 300 years and had never been able to open it. And somewhere in the biological gulf between the builders and the Vark, humanity fell on the builders' side of the line. Close enough. Not the same, not descendants, but close enough that the system said, yes, this is what hands are supposed to feel like. We're the right kind of hands, she said. Ravi looked at his own hands around the cup. They gave the vault to people who turned out to be the key, he said. That's either the worst mistake the most powerful civilization in the galaxy has ever made, or it's exactly what it looks like. Sierra said, and we should move faster than they expect. He nodded, got up, took his cup. At the door, Juno's boring that shaft day and night. I know, Sierra said. I added 2 medics to the rotation in case. Good. He left. The sensor display blinked its quiet numbers, atmospheric chain, incremental and certain. Outside on the ash plain, the crystals sang. On day 93, the first long-range sensors on the perimeter array flagged movement. In the outer system, multiple vessels, Verk configuration, coming in from the jump point at a deceleration rate that was not a survey approach or a diplomatic transit. Combat spread. Not weapons hot, the signatures weren't showing active weapon system engagement. But the formation was the kind that gave you options, the kind that let you do several different things quickly, depending on how the situation developed. When you arrived, 9 ships. Sierra stood at the sensor console and looked at the plot and thought about the fact that Rixor had needed an emergency session of the Verk High Council, and that emergency sessions required 8 members agreeing on an active threat, and that 9 ships in combat spread meant 8 members had agreed. She looked at the shaft Juno's crew was boring toward a 410 deep central chamber. 13 days, she'd told her. Marin, she said into her comm. Here, Marin said from the shaft site. How are we doing? 8 days, Marin said, maybe 7. Make it 6, Sierra said. Outside, the sky was the same bruised dark purple-gray it had always been. But the atmospheric sensors said it was, by the smallest of measurable margins, becoming less of what it had been. The 9 Verk ships fell toward Keth, Mora on their careful, options-preserving approach, and in the ground below the plane, in 410 of ancient darkness, something waited that had not been reached in 3,000 years. The clock was running, the Verk fleet, parked in high orbit on day 96. Not close, not the orbital position you used for observation or support. The position you used when you wanted everyone on the surface to be able to look up and understand their options without you having to say them out loud. 9 ships in a spread that covered every atmospheric entry corridor there. Running lights were on, which meant they weren't hiding. Hiding was a message. Being seen was also a message. Rixor's formal communication came through the standard diplomatic channel. 6 hours after the fleet established position. It was polite. It was the kind of polite that took careful preparation, the kind that wore courtesy the way armor is worn, every word fitted and intentional. He requested a meeting with Commander Voss at her earliest convenience. He expressed on behalf of the Verk High Council concern for the welfare of the Kethmore colony in light of certain unusual geological developments. He suggested that for the safety of the human population, a temporary suspension of survey activities in the ash plain zone might be considered advisable. Sierra read the communication 3 times, then she called a department head meeting. Then she sent a reply requesting that Rixor attend the meeting in person at the colony's main dome in 24 hours. She used the 24 hours to check on Marin's Bohr crew. How close? She asked. 30 m, Marin said. Her voice had a specific flatness that meant she was conserving everything non-essential for the work. May be less, the rocks changing down there, softer, like the material around the central chamber is different from the surrounding geology. Like it was built differently. Like it was built specifically, Marin said. Someone wanted that chamber accessible to a certain kind of drill or hand or whatever they expected to come. Looking. How long? 6 hours if the rock holds. Cooperative. She looked at the shaft. Housing. They parked 9 ships up there. Yes. 6 hours, Marin said, give or take. Rixor arrived the next morning with 2 Verk diplomatic aides and no military escort, which was either a genuine concession or a calculation that military escort was unnecessary given 9 ships overhead. Sierra met him at the airlock with Ravi and Juno because Ravi kept her grounded, and Juno kept the conversation from going anywhere safe. They sat in the main dome's common area. Same 3 tables pushed together, same coin water coffee which she offered, which he again declined. He opened with the polite version of what the 9 ships said less politely. The Verk High Council was concerned about the nature of the geological phenomena developing on the ash plain. Kethmora was a delicate environment. The subterranean survey activities could pose unknown risks to the human population. The council wished to discuss cooperative framework for managing. He used the word managing the situation responsibly. Sierra waited until he was done. What situation? She said. He looked at her. You said the situation, she said. I want to understand what we're managing. Our survey of a planet you gave us or something else. The geological activity is accelerating in ways that may pose safety risks, he said. The atmospheric processors are running at full capacity and the air quality in the dome cluster is nominal, Sierra said. Our medical team reports no increase in health events. The crystalline formations on the surface pose no physical danger to the colony. Our subsurface survey has confirmed no geological instability. She paused. What safety risk are you referring to? Rixor was quiet for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Sierra watched his face do something that well controlled Varrock faces very rarely did. It reorganized the diplomatic arrangement. shifted, something underneath it moved. He was going to try the direct approach. Kethmore's planetary file, he said, includes historical notation of anomalous subterranean structures dating from our initial survey 312 years ago. The origin of those structures is uncertain. The Verak High Council has reason to believe that engagement with those structures by unauthorized parties could have consequences that extend beyond Kethmore's local environment. Unauthorized parties. Juno across the table made a sound. That was not quite a word, Sierra caught it with a look. You knew about the underground structures when you offered this planet to humanity, Sierra said, not accusatory. Level, like she was checking a map. Coordinates. The structures were noted in the planetary file as of uncertain origin. And you knew, Sierra said. Another reorganization on his face. The structures were believed to be inert, he said, non-functional. Historical artifacts of a species that no longer exists. There was no anticipated risk of activation, Sierra said. The word landed between them. Silence from the two diplomatic aides. Silence from Juno, who was vibrating with the effort of staying quiet. Silence from Ravi, who had gone very still, the way Ravi went still when he was recording everything in his memory. For later, the Verkai Council, Rixor said, carefully requests that all human survey activities at depth be suspended, immediately pending a joint review of the planetary file and a formal agreement on the management of any subterranean discoveries. Sierra looked at him. No, she said. He blinked, all four eyes in sequence. Commander Voss, the Council's position. This is our planet, she said. You gave it to us formally, in treaty language. Witnessed by both our governments, we are surveying our planet's geology. We are not going to stop doing that because the civilization that gave it to us has decided it's suddenly interesting. She folded her hands on the table. If the Verkai Council has information about this planet's history that is relevant to our safety, we welcome that information fully, transparently, all of it. His fourth eye moved. The historical records are all of it, she said. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the eastern perimeter, the wind moved through the crystal formations and the cord rose and fell. He heard it, she watched him hear it. Something in his posture shifted very slightly, the way a body shifts when it recognizes something it has been trying to avoid recognizing. I will relay your position to the Council, he said. Please do, she said. Marin called it 1400 hours. We're through, she said, 2 words. All the weight in the known galaxy. Behind them, Sierra was already moving. The central chamber was not a room. She understood this the moment the descent cage, a proper cage now, not a harness, a platform Marin's crew had rigged on the expanded shaft, dropped through the ceiling. The ceiling of the central chamber was 18 m above the floor, and the floor was not flat. It was not flat because it was a surface, not a floor, a surface that curved in a slow, precise bowl, and in the lowest point of that bowl was something that had no name in any language Sierra had ever learned. It was about the size of the Harrow's bridge. It occupied the center of the chamber in a way that felt like gravity. Not physically, not literally, but the way certain things in the world arraign the space around themselves by the quality of their presence. It was made of the same material as the wall symbols, the same pale crystalline substance as the surface formations, but structured differently, layered in ways that implied internal complexity, built in ways that suggested it had not been constructed so much as grown to a specification. It was active. The pale blue light ran through it in constant slow patterns, cycling through sequences that Juno, who had descended 20 seconds ahead of Sira, was already watching with an expression Sira had never seen on her face before. Reverence was not a word Juno used. Often her face used it now. This is the control node, Juno said. This is what everything else connects to, every tunnel, every chamber, every crystal formation on the surface. They all spoke lines, and this is the hub. How does it work? Sira said. The same way the walls worked, Juno said. She looked at her own hands. Contact, biological contact specific. Enough that the system reads it as authorized. The walls were like a login. This is she searched for the word. This is the actual machine. Sira looked at the node, the light cycling through it, the patient rhythm of something that had been waiting a very long time for the right hands. What happens if you touch it? She said. Juno looked at her. I don't know. Guess. Juno looked back at the node. I think the whole system goes fully online. Whatever partial activation we've seen, the formations, the warming, the atmospheric changes, I think that's been the system's startup sequence. Diagnostic mode. She paused. This is the on switch. Sierra stood in the ancient chamber under 410 m of rock on a world that the most powerful civilization in the galaxy had abandoned 3,000 years ago because the thing at its center was locked behind a door they couldn't open. She thought about 9 ships in orbit. She thought about the way Rixor had said unauthorized parties and what that word choice told her about how the Verk thought of humans in relation to what was in this chamber. She thought about what a dead planet was worth and what a living one was worth, and what a network of ancient technology spread across who knew how many systems was worth, and who in the galaxy currently had their hands on it. Touch it, she said. Juno touched it. The light changed. Not just the node in the chamber. Simultaneously, as if the node's activation had sent a signal through the floor and walls and ceiling that arrived everywhere at the same moment. The pale blue deepened into something richer, more complex, a light that had more information in it than light usually carries. The floor vibrated, not a shudder, a resonance, the same fundamental frequency as the surface crystals felt through the boot soles rather than heard. The whole chamber was the chord. The whole chamber had always been the chord, waiting for someone to play it. Juno was very still, her hands flat on the node, eyes open, not looking at the light but at something else, something that was happening in the interface between her palms and the surface. It's reading me, she said. What do you mean, reading? It's analyzing, the way a lock analyzes a key, checking genetic markers. I think neural pattern, biological chemistry. It's comparing it to something. She paused, breathed. It likes what it finds. Juno. It's not dangerous, she said. It's glad. That's the wrong word, but it's the closest one. It's the way a tool feels when it's finally being used for the right purpose after a very long time. The light in the chamber reached a steady state, not cycling anymore, but present in a way that was fundamentally different from the shifting startup. Patterns on not warming up on. Sierra felt it through the floor, then through the walls, then through the shaft above them. She could feel it climbing the resonance, traveling up through 410 m of rock, toward the surface, and she knew without being able to explain how she knew that. It was reaching the surface formations, reaching the crystals, reaching all the way up through dead stone to the atmosphere above a dead world. Her comm crackled. Marin, Sierra, the surface. I know, Sierra said. The crystals are all of them. Simultaneously. I know. And the atmospheric sensors are. I know, Sierra said. I know is everyone. Okay up there. Everyone is fine, where everyone is. Fine. Marin's voice had something in it Sierra hadn't heard before, a specific quality of someone watching something that shouldn't be possible happen in real time. The sky looks different. How different? Lighter, Marin said. Just the edge, just at the horizon, but lighter. Sierra looked at Juno, still at the node, still reading or being read. Lighter sky on a planet that hadn't had a living sky in 3,000 years. The Verk fleet moved. Not to attack, not weapons hot, not closing intercept, but they reorganized. From the high cover spread to a tighter grouping, the formation that meant internal communication was happening. That the 9 ships were talking to each other about what they were seeing and what it meant. Rixor's communication came through 40 minutes after Juno's contact with the node. It was no longer polite. Commander Voss, the Verk High Council, has authorized me to inform you that what you have activated constitutes technology classified under Verk Interstellar Statute as Category 1. Restricted material. You are required to cease all contact with the installation immediately. Failure to comply will be considered a hostile action under the terms of the Verk Human Accords. Council's fleet is authorized to enforce compliance. Category 1 restricted material. Sierra sat with that, what it meant to have a classification for something. What it meant to have maintained that classification for 300 years and to have given the land above it to species you expected to fail and disappear. And to now be watching from 9 ships in orbit as something you had kept dark for 30 centuries came back on at the hands of the species you dismissed. She wrote her reply carefully. Rixor, Kethmara is human territory. Under the terms of the formal treaty, signed by both our governments and witnessed by 7 independent galactic entities. Whatever exists in Kethmara's subterranean geology is part of that territory and falls under human authority. We are conducting lawful survey and assessment of our own planet. We have no obligation to cease any activity. If the Verk High Council has documentation establishing a prior lawful claim to specific materials within Kethmara's geology, documentation that was available at the time of the treaty and was not disclosed, we would expect a full legal review of the treaty itself, including the question of what was withheld and by whom. She sent it. She went back to the surface. The horizon was lighter, not by much. Not enough to see color in it yet, but lighter. She stood at the perimeter and looked at the ash plain and thought about 30 centuries of dark and what the first edge of light at the horizon of a waking world looked like. The 9 ships sat in orbit. They didn't fire. She hadn't thought they would. What was in the ground wasn't a weapon. It was something older and more important than a weapon. And somewhere in the HFY Council, 8 members who had agreed on an active threat were now looking at their sensor readings from orbit and understanding what active actually meant. Not a threat, an inheritance, sitting in the hands of the species they'd written off. The crystals on the plane rose and fell with the chord, and the chord had harmonics in it now that it hadn't had before, deeper, richer, a sound made of something more than wind and crystal, the planet's own frequency coming up from below, the planet breathing. For the first time in 3,000 years, the HFY fleet stayed in orbit for 11 days without firing a single weapon. This was not patience. Patience implied a choice being made. What happened in those 11 days was not a choice. It was the HFY Council coming to terms with the fact that they had no good option, and the coming to terms took 11 days because when a civilization has operated from a position of absolute superiority for several thousand years, absorbing the loss of that position requires a significant internal reorganization. Sierra knew this because she'd watched the fleet's formation change 5 times in 11 days. Each change was a shift in consensus. Aboard those 9 ships, a different calculation about what was possible, what was advisable, what the costs were of various actions. Combat spread to diplomatic positioning, to observation spread to a holding pattern that had no real tactical name, because it was what 9 ships looked like when they weren't sure what they were anymore. She watched the fleet position changes, the way she watched the water rig output every morning the same time, logging the changes, noting the direction. Every change moved them further from the configuration that meant we are about to do something forceful. She had known it would, not because they were peaceful. 3,000 years ago they had not been peaceful, but because what was in Kethmoor's ground was not something you could reclaim by force. You couldn't unactivate it. You couldn't confiscate the key once the key had already opened the door. The planet systems were running. The network was online. The biological authorization had been given and recorded in something that didn't have an admin override. The HFY had one option, and it was the option they'd never used with humanity before. Rex so called on day 11. The HFY Council is prepared to discuss a framework, he said. His voice had changed, still controlled, still careful, but the specific quality that had underscored his entire relationship with humanity, the quality of a patient adult dealing with creatures that would eventually stop being relevant, was gone, replaced with something more level, more like the tone you used when you were talking to someone whose position in the room had shifted and you were adjusting for it. I'm available this afternoon, Sierra said. She was deliberately not smiling. Some things didn't need to be rubbed in. They met in the common dome again, same 3 tables, same terrible coffee, which this time Rex so accepted. He held the cup for a long time without drinking from it, which he suspected was the HFY equivalent of a gesture. He had 2 aides. Sierra had Ravi, Juno, and Marin, because Marin had built the shaft that had reached the chamber and was therefore as present in this moment as anyone. The framework Rex so proposed was dense, with language that tried to preserve the appearance of HFY authority while conceding the practical reality of what had changed. Joint oversight committees, shared access protocols, collaborative management of any network connections that extended to systems beyond Keth. Mara's local space. Sierra let him finish. Then she said, "Tell us what it is all of it, what the Elhari built." The name landed on the table between them like a stone dropped in still water. He looked at her. "Elhari," he said. "That's what the language is," Juno said. She'd been working the symbol catalog for 2 months with a linguistic AI built specifically for the purpose. It's what they called themselves. It's in the foundational headers of the system architecture. Elhari, this was their world. Rixor set down the coffee cup, looked at the table, looked up. "Yes," he said. "What happened to them?" Sierra said. The silence lasted long enough that she began to think he would not answer. Then, 3,040 years ago, the Verk encountered the Elhari for the first time. The Elhari occupied 17 worlds and maintained a network infrastructure that connected them: energy distribution, atmospheric management, communication, navigation, a living network managed by the planet nodes of which Kethmora was one. He paused. There was conflict. Nature of the conflict is complex. The outcome was that the Elhari were gone from all 17 worlds within 40 years. "Gone," Juno said. "Gone," he said. The word sat in the room. "And Kethmora," Sierra said. Kethmora was their foundational world, the first node of the network, the central node, in fact, the one from which all others were managed. Without Keth Mara's core, the rest of the network went offline. The Verk attempted to access it for several decades after the conflict. The system would not respond to Verk biological authorization. It had been built for Elhari hands. He looked at the table again. Eventually, the decision was made to classify the planet and the installation as inactive historical material and move forward. "And 300 years ago," Sierra said, "you surveyed it." "Yes," the installation remained inert. "We determined that without the correct biological key, it would remain inert indefinitely." He paused. The probability of encountering a species with sufficient biological similarity to Elhari to trigger authorization was calculated as extremely low. "How low?" Ravi asked. Rixor looked at him. "Astronomically low," he said. "In 40 years of conflict and 3,000 years following it, the Verk had never encountered any species that the system recognized." "And then you gave the planet to us," Sierra said. "The projections for colony survival were—" "You thought we would fail," Sierra said. "You thought we would struggle for a year and die, and the planet would stay locked and the problem would stay solved." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Instead," Sierra said, "we are apparently the right kind of hands." The silence after that lasted a long time. The full scope of what the Elhari network meant reached Earth Command 2 days later when the connection logs from Kethmora's central node were transmitted via Juno's analysis system. 17 worlds. 17 Elhari network nodes dormant for 3,000 years that had come back online when Kethmora's central node activated. Not all functional, some dead in ways that couldn't be corrected, some operational but in need of significant work, some apparently intact and simply waiting. The network's self-diagnostic was running across all 17 simultaneously, and the data it was generating was filling the colony server storage at a rate that required Mahrin to build 3 additional storage units in 48 hours. What the Elhari had built was not just an atmospheric management system, not just communication infrastructure. It was a planetary engineering framework. The ability to manage weather, soil, chemistry, atmospheric composition, temperature regulation, geological survey from orbit, all of it built into a network that covered 17 worlds, built to make planets livable, built to make dead places bloom. Earth Command sent a response that was, for once, brief. We are sending 30 ships. Hold everything. The first thing to grow on the ash plain appeared on day 107. Juno found it during her morning surface walk. She did a surface walk every morning now without the suit, because the atmospheric processors had been supplemented by the planet's own systems, and the air outside was thin and cold but breathable technically if you were healthy and didn't push it. She came back from her walk before breakfast and set a small container on the lab bench without saying anything. Inside the container, a thing the color of dark water, about the size of a thumbnail, growing in a crack in a piece of ash plain surface rock. Not mineral, not crystal. Biological. A plant, or the closest word they had for what it was, something that had roots in the rock and a surface the size of a fingernail that turned toward the dome's interior lights as Juno moved the container toward them. Light-seeking, alive, growing in soil that had been dead for 3,000 years. Marin looked at it for a very long time without speaking. The soil chemistry has been changing, Juno said. The atmospheric management component of the network has been slowly adjusting the surface mineral composition. Basically, it's been making soil for weeks now, getting it ready. For this, Marin said. For this, Juno said. Ravi picked up the container, tilted it gently. The small dark thing shifted toward the light, tracking it, doing the oldest thing any living thing does on a world it belongs to. He set it down carefully. We should name it, he said. It has a name, Juno said. She pulled up her translation work on the wrist display. 2 months of Elhari language reconstruction. The Elhari called this species their first cultivar, the first plant they developed for world seeding. The name translates to roughly what grows in dead soil. The room was quiet. That'll do, Marin said. The negotiation framework was finalized in the 3rd month. It took that long because the Verk negotiating team was working against the momentum of 3,000 years of unquestioned authority, and that kind of momentum didn't redirect quickly. They came with language built for managing lesser parties. Sierra's team sent it back, and they came with different language. Sierra's team sent that back too. On the 4th iteration, the language acknowledged human sovereign authority over all 17 Elhari worlds, pending formal survey and assessment of each. It acknowledged human authority over the Elhari network infrastructure. It acknowledged that access rights for any party, including the Verk, would be negotiated through human-governed processes. It acknowledged, in the careful formal prose of interstellar treaty language, that the Verk had known the history of Kethmore at the time of the treaty and had not disclosed it. That clause had been Ravi's idea. He drafted it at 3:00 one morning and left it on Sierra's desk. She'd read it, added 3 words that sharpened it, and put it in the next iteration. The Verk had argued against that clause For 2 full weeks. It was in the final document. Rixor came to the colony for the last time on the day the treaty was signed. He arrived without aids, sat at the 3 pushed-together tables, accepted the terrible coffee without being offered it, which meant he'd gotten used to it at some point without noticing. The treaty signing itself was brief, a formality at that point. Both governments had already ratified it. Electronically, the in-person ceremony was for the record, and Sira suspected for something else, for the weight that ceremonies carry that documents alone don't. After it was done and the recorders were off and the aides and diplomatic staff had cleared the room, Rixor remained. Just him and Sira and the terrible coffee. "May I ask a question?" he said. "Yes," she said. "How did you know," he said, "that touching the wall was safe?" Sira thought about Juno's unsanctioned survey run, about the right angles, the dust, about a woman who didn't ask permission before doing things that mattered. "We didn't," she said. He absorbed that. "You proceeded without knowing the outcome." "We proceeded because the alternative was doing nothing," she said, "and doing nothing on a planet people were telling us was worthless was the one thing we couldn't afford." He was quiet for a moment. "The Elhari," he said, "were a species that built things to last. Everything they made was built to endure, to wait, to function when conditions were right." He turned the cup in his hands. "They built the network to recognize their own, to wait for their own to return." "But they didn't return," Sierra said. "No," he said, "they did not." He looked at the coffee. "You are not them." "No," she said, "we're not." "But you are what came," he said. Sierra looked at him, at Four Eyes doing something she'd never seen Verk Eyes do. Not calculating, not managing, not reading a situation for advantage. Just looking. "Yes," she said, "we are what came." He nodded once, stood, retrieved his helmet. At the door he stopped, didn't turn back. "The species the Elhari most resembled genetically," he said, "based on the biological samples we recovered from this world 300 years ago, the closest match in our records is human." He left. Sierra sat with her coffee and that information for a long time. She went to the eastern perimeter on the evening of the treaty signing day and stood where she always stood, where the dome cluster ended and the ash plain began, and she looked at what Kethmora was becoming. The crystals were still there, more of them now, taller, but they were no longer the most visible thing. The dark, small ground plants had spread in the weeks since Juno's first finding, slowly, carefully, doing what they had apparently been engineered to do for 3,000 years, while waiting for the right soil. They spread along the base of the crystal formations, along the fissures, in the hard pan, in every place where the ancient network had been adjusting the mineral chemistry, preparing the ground, doing patient, long work toward a specific outcome. The sky was different than it had been on landing day. Not dramatically, not the kind of chain that a photograph would catch. Immediately, the bruised purple was still there, the pressing dark of an atmosphere too thin to scatter light the way Earth did, but the horizon held color now that it hadn't held before. Thin line of something at the edge of the sky, not blue, not exactly the specific color that exists at the very beginning of an atmosphere learning to be an atmosphere again, no word for it in any language currently in use. Juno had started writing it down in the Alhari translation notes, building. Toward a name. What grows in dead soil caught the last of the day's light at Sierra's feet and turned toward it. 30 human ships were coming from Earth, carrying people and equipment and the immense organized energy of a species that had been handed a dead world as an insult and had turned it into something. The most powerful civilization in the galaxy was now negotiating to access. Old Marin came to stand beside her. She did that sometimes in the evenings. Appeared without announcement, stood without explanation, looked at things. Water tastes better, Marin said. Yeah, Sierra said. Still not good, Marin said, but better. Give it time, Sierra said. They stood together and watched the thin new color hold at the horizon, the edge of a sky, learning slowly and seriously what it meant to be alive again. Beneath them, in 410 m of warm underground dark, the Alhari network ran its patient patterns through crystal and stone and 3,000 years of waiting. Marin picked up a piece of surface rock from the edge of the perimeter, turned it over at the underside where it had been in contact with the ground. A few small dark roots clung to it. She looked at them for a long time. Hell of a dead world, she said. Sierra looked at the horizon, at the color. With no name. Not anymore, she said. The wind moved across the ash plain. Crystals rose. The chord they sang was the same chord it had always been, but fuller now, rooted now, running through a world that was breathing instead of holding its breath. Somewhere in that sound, if you listened for it, you could hear what 3,000 years of waiting to be found felt like when the waiting was finally over. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, the way all living things are present when they are finally, after everything, home.